The Boy Who Never Aged, The Impossible Child of 1867. Hook, the Impossible Child. In the years that followed the American Civil War, life in small towns was marked by silence and suspicion. Families rebuilt their farms, soldiers returned with scars both visible and unseen, and whole communities tried to sew themselves back together after 4 years of horror. It was in this fragile atmosphere, sometime in 1867, that whispers began about a child who did not belong. A boy whose very existence unsettled those around him, for he seemed untouched by the passage of time. The story was first told around oil lamps and in the pews of a small wooden church. Mothers leaned close to one another, their voices hushed, while children listened wide-eyed. "He doesn't change," one woman whispered, clutching her shawl. "He was born 4 years ago, and he still looks like he's just begun to walk." Others nodded nervously, as if saying it out loud might invite the boy's presence into their own homes. The priest, a stern man who carried the Bible as though it were a weapon, called him cursed. Doctors, few and far between in rural America, came with their bags of crude instruments and declared him impossible. But the neighbors had no word for him, no word except fear. The farmhouse where he lived sat at the edge of the fields, surrounded by a wooden fence that creaked with the wind. At dusk, the place seemed ordinary. Smoke rose from the chimney, the silhouettes of parents and siblings moved behind the curtained windows, and the sound of boots on wooden floors echoed faintly across the yard. But those who passed claimed they felt something else in the air, something heavy, a silence too thick, as if the house itself held a secret it wished to keep. According to the few who dared speak openly, the boy was born under strange circumstances. He did not cry, they said, not even once. Instead, his eyes opened wide, locking onto the midwife who delivered him. She claimed later that it felt as though the child saw through her, as if he carried knowledge that no infant should possess. At first, his parents thought they had been blessed with an unusually calm child, free of the colic and endless crying that plagued other families. But calm soon turned to uncanny. By the time he should have been 2 or 3, toddling around and learning his first words, neighbors noticed that his face never changed. His cheeks remained round, his skin smooth, his hair as fine and short as the day he was born. Children who once played alongside him outgrew their toys, their voices deepened, their limbs lengthened, but he remained the same. Always small. Always young. Always silent in a way that made others uneasy. Some said the boy rarely spoke at all, but when he did, his words cut deeply. One farmer swore that the child, no more than 4 years old in appearance, had asked him, "How long do you think you'll live?" The farmer laughed nervously, but the boy didn't smile. His eyes, too old for his face, stared with a coldness that stayed with the man for the rest of his life. Others recalled him quoting scripture he should not have known, passages about eternal life and the wages of sin. Soon, fear spread beyond whispers. Dogs barked when he walked by. Horses pulled at their reins. Mothers told their children to keep away from the farmhouse at dusk, and fathers avoided eye contact with his father in town. A few bold men urged the priest to intervene, to cast out what they believed was unnatural. But the priest hesitated. Deep down, even he was afraid. Imagine standing outside that farmhouse as night fell. The fields around you stretching into darkness, the oil lamps flickering faintly behind the curtains, the faint murmur of voices inside. And then, silence. A silence so complete it pressed against your ears, a silence that seemed alive. Those who lingered too long swore they saw the boy staring at them through the window, unblinking, his face pale in the lamplight. This was no ordinary child. At least, not in the minds of those who lived in that town. To them, he was a sign of something they could not name, a punishment, a prophecy, or perhaps a reminder that not everything human was made by God. Thus began the legend of the boy who never aged. His name is lost to history, erased by fear in time. But his story, whispered in farmhouse kitchens and recorded in fragments by those who dared to remember, still lingers. For some say that when the night grows too quiet, when the lamps burn low, and when the wind falls still, you can almost hear the sound of boots on wooden floors inside an empty farmhouse. And in that silence, the boy still waits. The year was 1867. America was still trembling from the shockwaves of the Civil War, a nation divided, bleeding, and struggling to sew itself back together. Entire towns lay in ruins, fields once rich with crops were charred, and soldiers limped home with wounds that would never heal, some visible, some hidden deep within their minds. It was a fragile time, and in that fragility, superstition took root more strongly than reason. In rural America, far from the noise of Washington politics and the grand cities of the East, small towns lived by faith, rumor, and the cycles of the land. Life was simple, but it was also harsh. The average family rose with the sun, worked their farms until their hands blistered, and prayed that the weather would not betray them. Any misfortune, a failed harvest, a sick child, a sudden death was seen as more than bad luck. It was a sign, a punishment, or a curse. And when strange things happened, people rarely looked for science. They looked for blame. The cultural mindset of 1867 was steeped in both religion and fear. The Civil War had killed more than 600,000 men, leaving behind widows, orphans, and entire communities that no longer trusted the world as they once did. Churches filled with desperate prayers. Ministers preached of judgment, salvation, and the dangers of straying too far from God's path. To a deeply religious farmer, an unexplainable event was never neutral, it was always moral. And when a child appeared who did not age as the years passed, no one saw him as a miracle. They saw him as a threat. Medicine at the time was crude. Germ theory had only just begun to take hold, and many doctors still believed in balancing humors, bloodletting, or blaming illness on foul air. Few physicians traveled to rural towns, and when they did, their explanations often sounded no better than folklore. If a child grew sick, people assumed it was the mother's fault for angering God or failing to keep the home pure. If a cow died unexpectedly, whispers of curses or witchcraft spread quickly. And if an entire family was said to harbor a boy who never changed, well, the town needed no convincing that something dark was at play. The architecture of rural towns reflected this mood of caution. Wooden churches stood at their centers, with graveyards sprawling just behind them, daily reminders of death's constant presence. Schoolhouses taught basic reading and arithmetic, but teachers also instilled obedience and piety. Newspapers carried stories of miraculous healings and bizarre happenings, mixing fact with fiction until people no longer distinguished the two. When a local farmer or shopkeeper spoke of seeing something strange, it carried the weight of truth because there was little else to believe in. In such an environment, a boy who never aged could not be seen as natural. He could not even be seen as human. He became a reflection of every anxiety the town carried: fear of the unknown, fear of punishment, fear that the war had left behind more than just widows and ashes. The Civil War had taught Americans that monsters did not only exist in ghost stories. They walked among men, on battlefields soaked with blood. To find one in a child was simply too much to bear. The mid-19th century was also an age of strange entertainments. Traveling circuses and sideshows drew curious crowds with displays of the bizarre, the bearded lady, the giant, the two-headed calf preserved in a jar. People paid good money to gawk at what was different. But difference at a distance was entertainment. Difference in your own town, in the boy who lived down the road, that was danger. And unlike the circus performers who eventually packed up and moved on, the boy who never aged was not leaving. This was the climate in which his story grew. A climate of suspicion, faith, and desperation. The whispers about him did not spread because he was extraordinary, but because people needed an explanation for everything wrong in their lives. If the harvest failed, it was the boy. If a child grew sick, it was the boy. If the preacher's wife miscarried, it was the boy. He became not just a curiosity, but a scapegoat. And in 1867, in the silence of a town struggling to recover from war, that was all it took to turn a rumor into a legend. Thus, before the first tragedy was even laid at his feet, before the first fire, the first death, or the first disappearance, the boy who never aged had already been marked. Not as a child of God, not as a wonder, but as a curse carried in human skin. And from that judgment, there would be no escape. The earliest witnesses to the boy's strange condition were those present at his birth. The midwife who delivered him told a story that she later refused to repeat in public, but which spread nonetheless through whispers. According to her, the child did not cry. He did not scream, nor gasp, nor wail as most newborns do. Instead, his eyes opened wide and locked onto hers. The midwife said it was as if the infant studied her, with a calm and knowing stare that belonged to an old man rather than a baby. She left the farmhouse shaken, muttering to herself that no good could come of such a child. His parents, a modest farming couple, tried to believe otherwise. They named him, baptized him, and raised him as they had raised their other children. For the first year, nothing seemed unusual beyond his quietness. But by the time he should have begun walking and talking, concern grew. His body remained small, his face unchanged. His siblings grew taller, their voices louder, their steps quicker. He stayed as he was, a toddler's body with eyes that seemed far too alert. Neighbors began to notice. When the mother brought him to church, whispers followed. Women covered their mouths with handkerchiefs and muttered, "Why does he still look the same?" The local pastor, Reverend Harlan, spoke to the family privately after a Sunday service. "God's work is mysterious," he said, his voice low, "but sometimes the devil hides in mystery as well." The family took offense, but they also felt the weight of his words. They stopped bringing the boy to church. By the age of 6, the boy's condition could no longer be ignored. Other children in town played games, learned their letters, and grew restless in school benches. But he remained small, his face frozen in permanent childhood. Neighbors noticed that he seemed to observe more than he played, as if he were studying them. When asked a question, he often responded with something unsettling. A shopkeeper recalled the boy asking, "Why do people die in their sleep?" with an expressionless face. The shopkeeper laughed nervously, but later told his wife he could not shake the feeling that the child already knew the answer. Family friends visited less and less. Invitations to community gatherings were no longer extended. The family, once respected in town, became objects of suspicion. Some whispered that the mother had sinned and that the boy was her punishment. Others said the father had struck a deal with dark forces during the war and that this child was his price. None of these rumors had proof, but proof was not required. In a rural town in 1867, whispers carried the weight of fact. One evening, a farmer passing their house swore he saw the boy staring from an upstairs window. The child's face was pale in the lamplight, his eyes fixed unblinking on the road. The farmer quickened his pace, but he claimed that when he glanced back, the boy was still watching, still frozen, like a statue, as if he had not moved at all. The story spread by morning, and it only deepened the town's unease. Even the siblings began to distance themselves. Older brothers and sisters, embarrassed and frightened, avoided him. They whispered among themselves that he sometimes spoke words in his sleep, phrases they could not understand, but which sounded like prayers or curses. The mother begged them not to repeat such things outside the family. But children talk, and soon the town knew. By the time the boy should have been 10, the first witnesses, the midwife, the pastor, the neighbors, were already convinced. This was not a normal child. He did not belong among them. Some thought he was cursed. Others thought he was a sign. But all agreed on one thing: he was something they could not explain, and explanations in those days often turned dark. As the years passed, the boy's presence seemed to cast a shadow over everything around him. It was not only that he did not grow, but that the world itself seemed to resist his existence. The family's farm, once fertile, became a place of unease. Crops withered without explanation, even when tended with the same care as the neighboring fields. Corn stalks grew stunted, wheat turned brittle, and fruit rotted on the vine before it could ripen. Neighbors whispered that the land itself rejected him, as though nature knew what people only suspected, that the boy did not belong. Animals were the first to show their fear. Horses balked when he approached, eyes wide, ears pinned back. Dogs growled low in their throats or whined, tails tucked, when he entered a room. A cow that had given steady milk for years suddenly went dry after the boy patted her flank. Even the birds seemed to avoid the farmhouse. The yard grew unnaturally silent when he stepped outside, as though the natural world held its breath. Stories began to spread. A neighbor swore he saw the boy standing alone in the field one night, staring up at the moon. The man claimed the air grew cold, and his lantern dimmed as he passed by. Another told of waking to find the boy at the edge of his property, watching silently, his pale face just visible in the starlight. When the man shouted, the child did not move. He only turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness without a word. Tragedies soon followed. The first was a fire that consumed the family's barn. The father swore the lantern had been secured, yet flames erupted in the night, devouring wood and hay in minutes. The townsfolk whispered that it was no accident that the boy had willed it into being. "He looks like a child," muttered one farmer, "but he brings ruin like a plague." Soon after, a neighboring farmer collapsed in his field, dead before help could reach him. His wife claimed she had seen the boy watching from the fence line earlier that morning. "His eyes were on us," she said, weeping. "Like he was waiting." It did not matter that the man had been old, or that his heart had long been weak. In the minds of the town, the boy was the cause. Within the farmhouse, the family tried to hold on to normal life, but even they began to falter. The mother confessed to a friend that the boy sometimes spoke in his sleep, muttering words she did not understand, phrases in a language she had never heard. The father grew gaunt, his once proud voice breaking under the weight of whispers and suspicion. The siblings avoided him, refusing to share meals or games. He became a ghost in his own home, a presence tolerated but never embraced. The pastor, pressed by fearful townsfolk, visited one evening. He entered the farmhouse with Bible in hand, convinced he could find an answer in prayer. But when he looked upon the boy, sitting silently in a chair, his confidence faltered. "Child," the pastor said, his voice trembling, "do you know who made you?" The boy lifted his gaze, eyes too old for his small face, and replied, "Do you?" The pastor left that night pale and shaken, refusing to speak of what he had seen. He never returned. By now, the farm was considered cursed ground. Travelers avoided the road that passed too close, preferring to take the long way around. Children dared one another to run to the fence and touch it, but few had the courage. And those who did swore that the wood felt icy cold, even in the summer heat. As the boy remained unchanged, the town around him grew harder, more suspicious. Every misfortune, every shadow, every unexplained noise was laid at his feet. It was as if the town itself needed him to be the source of their suffering, a vessel into which they poured every fear left behind by the war. He was no longer just a child who never again was becoming a curse given human form. And in the silence of the farmhouse, as oil lamps flickered and the wind rattled the windows, the boy sat quietly, watching, as though he knew what they believed and accepted it. As the legend of the boy spread beyond the town, whispers reached the ears of physicians and scholars who prided themselves on reason rather than superstition. In the years after the Civil War, America was slowly opening itself to new ideas in medicine, science, and natural philosophy. Yet even in this age of discovery, the boy represented a challenge no textbook could answer. He became an object of curiosity not just for fearful townsfolk, but for men of science determined to prove the impossible wrong. The first doctor to arrive was a traveling physician from Chicago, a man named Dr. Alcott. He was known for carrying strange instruments in a leather case, stethoscopes, glass syringes, even a magnifying lens. When he entered the farmhouse, he expected to find exaggeration, a malnourished child, perhaps, or one suffering from a wasting illness that stunted his growth. Instead, he found a boy whose body was perfectly healthy, skin smooth, eyes alert, pulse steady. The child looked no more than 7 years old, yet according to the family, he had already lived more than a decade. Dr. Alcott recorded his findings in a notebook that later vanished, but fragments of his words survive in local retellings. The subject presents no signs of deterioration. Musculature appropriate for a child of 7. Heartbeat slow but strong. Eyes remarkably focused. There is a stillness in Hyman, absence of time. He left after 2 days, shaken, refusing to speak of it further. Other doctors followed. A physician from St. Louis, Dr. Merriweather, took small samples of the boy's blood using a thin needle and glass vial. He reported that the blood clotted unusually fast, as though it resisted change. Another, Dr. Whitcomb, remarked that the boy's hair never seemed to grow longer. "It is as if his body has reached a state of suspension," he wrote. "Neither moving forward nor backward, locked between life and death." The family endured these visits with a mixture of hope and dread. The mother prayed that science might offer an answer, while the father grew weary of men who treated their son like a specimen. The boy himself, silent and watchful, endured the prodding and measuring without complaint. But sometimes, when the doctors left the room, he whispered to his mother, "They cannot help me." Of course, medicine in the 1860s was still primitive. Theories of germs were new and controversial. Microscopes revealed only hints of what lay hidden in blood and tissue. To these men, the boy was an enigma that hovered on the edge of explanation. They speculated wildly. Some thought him an example of arrested development, others believed he carried a mutation that stopped his growth. A few even spoke of immortality, though they did so only behind closed doors, fearing ridicule. Not all who came were physicians. One visitor was a scholar of natural philosophy from Boston, Professor Alden, who dabbled in mesmerism and the study of vital forces. He claimed the boy radiated a kind of energy, an invisible aura that unsettled the compass needle he carried. When he pressed the child's hand, he swore he felt a vibration, as if the boy's very flesh resisted the flow of time. The townsfolk mocked him, calling him a charlatan, but his words added fuel to the fire of legend. With each failed attempt to explain him, fear in the town deepened. The doctors left with unanswered questions, leaving behind a trail of rumors that the boy was not human, that he had been sent as a warning, that science itself had recoiled from him. The pastor declared that if even physicians could not understand him, then surely his origin was unholy. And so the boy remained, untouched by years, a mystery to both faith and reason. In time, fewer doctors came. The family stopped answering the knock of strangers with notebooks and instruments. The boy, unchanged, sat at the window and watched the road, as if he knew the world had failed to claim him. Science had tried, and failed. The town had prayed, and failed. And so he endured neither miracle nor monster, but something in between. By the time the boy should have been a grown man, his parents had aged into gray-haired figures, stooped and weary from years of hard labor and harder stares from the community. Yet their son remained the same, a child no taller, no older than when he first began to walk. He still had the round cheeks of youth, the small hands, the steady, watchful eyes that unnerved even those who loved him. His siblings had long since left the farm, choosing to build lives elsewhere, but the boy remained, frozen in time, bound to his parents' side. By now, the town's patience had thinned into resentment. What had once been whispers had grown into open hostility. Men spat on the ground when they passed the family in town. Mothers pulled their children close, shielding them from the boy's gaze. Every misfortune in the community was laid at his feet: failed crops, stillborn livestock, sudden illness. "He is not meant to be here," one farmer declared at the tavern, his words met with nods of agreement. As long as that child remains, none of us are safe. The breaking point came after a season of particularly cruel misfortunes. A drought withered the fields. A fever spread through the town, taking the lives of several children. And then, on a moonless night, a fire swept through the mill, destroying one of the town's most vital resources. No one saw the boy there, but in the eyes of the townsfolk, no proof was needed. By dawn, men were gathering in small groups, muttering of curses and judgment. The pastor, Reverend Harlan, once cautious, now stood before his congregation and declared, "We must act. We must not allow this abomination to linger among us any longer." His words carried the force of Scripture, and the town, desperate for a scapegoat, rallied behind him. There was talk of confronting the family, of driving them out, of taking the boy and turning him over to the authorities or worse. But something else was already in motion. Strangers had been seen in town, men in dark coats who spoke little and carried notebooks. They visited the tavern, asked questions about the family, and left without explanation. Some believed they were government agents, sent from Washington to investigate. Others thought they were scientists, hungry for the secrets locked inside the boy's body. Either way, their presence fueled the fire of fear. If outsiders wanted the boy, then surely he was dangerous. Then, without warning, the farmhouse stood empty. It happened in the space of a single night. Neighbors claimed they heard nothing unusual, no wagons on the road, no shouts, no hurried footsteps. Yet when the sun rose, the house was abandoned. Meals were left half-eaten on the table, clothes still hung by the hearth to dry, tools rested by the door as if waiting for work. It was as though the family had vanished into thin air. The town searched for days, combing the fields and nearby woods. No trace of wagon wheels, no footprints, no signs of struggle. The family had been erased, leaving only silence behind. Some whispered that the government had come in the dead of night, spiriting them away to hidden laboratories. Others said the family had fled on their own, desperate to escape the judgment of neighbors. And a few, more fearful, insisted that something unnatural had taken them all, that the boy had finally revealed his true nature. The farmhouse became a monument to dread. Windows dark, doors unlatched, dust gathering on plates that would never be used again. Travelers avoided the road that passed it, and children dared one another to touch its gate. No one stayed long. Some swore they still saw a figure in the upstairs window at night, small and pale, watching the road with eyes too old for his face. This was the turning point, the moment when the boy was no longer just a rumor or a curse whispered in the tavern. He had become a legend. His family gone, his fate unknown, he lingered not in flesh but in memory. And memory, in small towns, often outlives the truth. With the family gone and the farmhouse abandoned, the boy slipped from the realm of daily gossip into the darker, more enduring world of folklore. In the absence of facts, stories multiplied, each retelling reshaping the child into something greater, stranger, and more terrifying than he had been in life. Theories sprouted like weeds, and soon the boy was no longer just a memory but a legend passed from mouth to mouth, whispered around firesides and written in the margins of local diaries. One of the most common theories was that the government had taken him. In an age when distrust of authority ran deep, many believed that men from Washington had spirited the boy and his family away in the dead of night. They spoke of hidden laboratories, where doctors and scientists prodded his immortal flesh, seeking the secret to eternal life. The boy, they said, was no longer free, was a prisoner of knowledge, trapped behind iron doors where his eyes never closed and his body never aged. Others insisted the family had fled on their own, driven from their home by the hatred of neighbors. In this telling, the parents became tragic figures, forced to wander with their cursed son, always one step ahead of torches and pitchforks. They were seen in Kansas, some said, or in Missouri. Farmers swore they glimpsed a wagon rolling by at dusk, a pale child staring from the canvas flap as the wheels rattled over dirt roads. But when pursued, the wagon vanished as if swallowed by the night. A darker theory claimed the boy had never been human at all. Old women in town whispered that he was a changeling, creature left by spirits in place of a real child. His refusal to grow was proof, they said, that he belonged not to man but to something older and crueler. Folklorists, picking up the tale years later, compared him to European myths of fairy children and eternal wanderers. But the people who had known him needed no such comparisons. To them, he was a demon that wore the skin of a boy. Still others clung to the idea that the boy had been blessed rather than cursed. They spoke of saints who never aged, holy men whose flesh resisted time. Perhaps, they argued, God had sent a miracle, but mankind had been too blind to see it. These believers were few, and they rarely spoke their views aloud, for fear of scorn. But even in hushed tones, they wondered, what if he was not a punishment, but a gift? Sightings continued for decades. In 1883, a newspaper in Ohio carried a curious report of a boy seen working in a blacksmith's shop. He was described as small, pale, with eyes that seemed too wise. The article dismissed it as a prank, but locals remembered. In 1897, a schoolteacher in Pennsylvania wrote in her diary of a strange child who appeared at the edge of her class, watching silently before vanishing. And in 1904, a group of railroad workers in Kentucky claimed a boy visited their campfire one night, asking for food. When questioned, he gave no name and disappeared by dawn. Each story was different in detail but identical in essence, a boy, no older than 10, whose presence unsettled the air. The more the legend spread, the less anyone cared whether he had ever truly lived. He became an idea, a cautionary tale told to children who lingered too long in the woods. Don't wander off, mothers warned. Or the boy who never aged will find you. Legends thrive where facts fade, and by the turn of the century, the boy was no longer bound to one town or one family. He roamed the country in story, a restless phantom of childhood, eternal and unchanging. Whether he had been a miracle, a curse, or simply an unexplainable child lost to history no longer mattered. What mattered was the fear he inspired and the way that fear kept his story alive. Thus the boy entered the pantheon of America's strangest folklore, standing beside the tales of the Bell Witch, the Jersey Devil, and the lost colony of Roanoke. His face, pale and unchanging, haunted the imagination of a people desperate for meaning in the shadows. And somewhere, in the silence of a farmhouse remembered only in dreams, the legend of the boy who never aged waited to be told again. As decades passed, the tale of the boy who never aged began to attract not only scholars of folklore but mystics, occultists, and seekers of hidden truths. What had once been a local curiosity, whispered in the dark corners of taverns and kitchens, now found its way into esoteric journals, seances, and secret societies fascinated with the unexplained. To them, the boy was not merely a mystery of flesh and blood, it was a sign, perhaps even a key, to greater forces at work in the world. Spiritualists of the late 19th century, already enthralled with the idea of communicating with the dead, claimed the boy was a bridge between realms. His refusal to age was seen as evidence that he was not bound to earthly time but existed in some liminal state between life and eternity. In seances held in New York and Philadelphia, mediums claimed to channel his voice, describing a child who spoke in ancient tongues and warned of calamities yet to come. Whether genuine or fraud, these seances gave the legend new life. Occultists were quick to adopt him into their own frameworks. Some argued he was a vessel of eternal energy, a living philosopher's stone, proof that the alchemist's dream had manifested not in gold but in human flesh. Others whispered of darker origins, that he was a child of Lilith, or a spirit placed in human form as punishment or test. To secret societies dabbling in hidden knowledge, his story was not just folklore, it was a riddle begging to be solved. Mystical interpretations also wove the boy into biblical prophecy. Preachers of fringe sects declared him to be a sign of the end times, a child spared from aging to herald the second coming. pamphlets circulated claiming he was the eternal witness spoken of in Revelation. These writings were sensational, often riddled with contradictions, yet they spread widely among believers hungry for signs in a rapidly changing world. By the turn of the 20th century, the boy had also become a figure in folk magic. In Appalachia, some claimed charms made from soil taken from the ruins of his farmhouse could cure sickness or ward off evil. In the bayous of Louisiana, storytellers blended his tale with voodoo lore, describing him as a wandering Loa who brought both blessing and curse. Each retelling bent the legend into new shapes, proving how flexible and enduring such myths could be. Writers of the early occult revival, including those influenced by theosophy, even tied the boy to theories of reincarnation and karma. They speculated that he was a soul trapped in an unfinished cycle, unable to move forward or backward. His child's body was not a blessing nor a curse but a prison, holding him in a state of spiritual suspension. Only through some cosmic resolution, they argued, could his soul be freed. Meanwhile, skeptics scoffed. They insisted the boy had been a simple hoax, exaggerated by frightened neighbors and opportunists. But believers countered that legends which survived decades do so for a reason. For them, the boy's refusal to fade into obscurity was itself evidence of his significance. Truth, they argued, is often hidden within myth, like a seed inside fruit. And so the mystical interpretations multiplied, branching into countless directions, each new telling adding another layer of meaning. To some, he was a prophet. To others, a demon. To others still, a victim of fate. But in every telling, he was eternal, frozen at the edge of human understanding, a reminder that the world holds mysteries that no science, no religion, no philosophy has yet explained. The boy who never aged had become more than a legend. He was a mirror, reflecting the fears, hopes, and beliefs of each generation that spoke his name. And in that mirror, people saw not only the impossible child of 1867 but the boundless mystery of existence itself. By the early 20th century, the legend of the boy who never aged had already passed through countless retellings, but it was the stories of his final fate or lack thereof that gave the legend its most chilling edge. The absence of closure was itself a climax, a question that refused to be answered. What became of the impossible child? Some said that he reappeared in fleeting glimpses across the country. In small towns from Ohio to Mississippi, travelers swore they encountered a boy with pale skin and eyes that seemed to know too much. He would appear at dusk, asking for food or shelter, then vanish before dawn. Always the same height, the same face, never older. Those who encountered him often fell ill afterward, or suffered uncanny misfortunes, as if his presence carried a lingering curse. One tale spoke of a train conductor in 1912 who noticed a boy boarding late at night without a ticket. When questioned, the boy simply stared at him, silent. The conductor looked away for only a moment, and when he turned back, the boy was gone. The train had not stopped, the doors had not opened, yet the seat was empty. Passengers claimed they still felt a chill where he had been. Another account came from a hospital in Baltimore in 1921, where nurses whispered of a child patient who did not appear on any register. He was said to roam the halls at night, slipping into rooms of the dying, watching them with solemn eyes until their breathing ceased. Doctors denied his existence, but patients described him in identical detail, small, pale, and unchanging. But perhaps the most unsettling story emerged from the ruins of the old farmhouse itself. By then, the house was nothing more than a shell, its wood rotting, roof caving inward. Children dared one another to sneak inside, and in 1933, a group of teenagers claimed they found footprints in the dust, small, barefoot, impossibly fresh. They followed them up the staircase to an empty room, where a single chair faced the window. On the chair lay a doll, old and brittle, with glass eyes that mirrored the description of the boy's own. The footprints ended there. The climax of the legend is not a revelation but a void. There is no grave, no body, no proof of death. Unlike other folktales that resolve with closurian exorcism, a banishment, a final confrontation, the story of the boy ends in uncertainty. This uncertainty is precisely what gives it its power. The boy's fate is a blank canvas onto which each generation paints its own fears, that he was taken by the government, that he still wanders the earth, or that he was never truly human at all. Folklorists who study the tale argue that its endurance comes from this lack of conclusion. Without an ending, the story can never die. It lives on in the telling, passed from parent to child, from neighbor to stranger. Each retelling becomes an invitation. What if he is still out there? What if the boy who never aged waits in the shadows, unseen but eternal? The climactic mystery of the boy is that there is no climax, only a lingering dread. A child frozen in time, a story frozen without end. And in that endlessness lies the terror, for the unknown is always more haunting than the known. Every legend has a way of outgrowing its origins, and the boy who never aged is no exception. What began as whispers in a small rural town in 1867 became a tale that spans states, decades, and even belief systems. In the absence of certainty, stories multiplied, each new generation reshaping him to reflect their own fears and hopes. To some, he was a curse. To others, a miracle. To most, he was a reminder of the thin line between the known and the unknown. What makes his story endure is not the details of his life, those are too few, too fragile, but the voids. The unanswered questions. The farmhouse left behind. The parents who vanished without explanation. The child who never changed, yet somehow changed the way people saw the world. Legends thrive in mystery, and this legend was made of nothing else. The boy's story also reveals something about the people who told it. The townsfolk who saw curses in every misfortune. The scientists who tried to impose reason and found themselves staring into something they could not define. The mystics who wrapped him in prophecy and saw in him the reflection of eternity. Each of them added their voice, and in doing so, created a chorus of belief and fear that still echoes. In this way, the boy became more than a child frozen in time, he became a mirror. A mirror for a town scarred by war, for a nation grappling with change, for a world that will always seek to explain the inexplicable. Perhaps that is why his story refuses to fade, because he embodies the mystery we all live with. We age, we change, we die. But he did not. And in that difference lies the haunting allure. As with all folklore, the truth is likely buried under layers of fear, exaggeration, and imagination. Maybe there was a real boy, afflicted with some rare condition. Maybe there was a family who fled from persecution. Or maybe it was all invention, a story born of a community's need for an explanation to suffering they could not control. We will never know. And perhaps it is better that way. For in the end, the boy who never aged belongs not to history but to storytelling. He lives in the words spoken by firelight, in the pages of forgotten journals, in the imagination of anyone who wonders what it would mean to stand still while the world moves on. He is both impossible and inevitably a reminder that even in a world of progress and reason, mystery still has its place. So if you ever pass through a quiet town at dusk, where the air seems colder than it should be and the silence carries weight, listen closely. Some say you may hear the faint sound of small footsteps on wooden floors, or catch a glimpse of a pale face in an empty window. And if you do, perhaps you will understand why his story still lingers. The Boy Who Never Aged is not just a tale of 1867. He is a question without an answer. And as long as questions endure, so too will he.